conference. We survived the rain, survived the snow, survived the cold weather, sunny morning again. We have a fabulous panel, an intellectually important panel on Japanese constitutional problems. I think we have been discussing using this German, especially the Weimar Constitution, as a key reference point. Whereas, for me at least, the Japanese constitutional problems seem to be another extremely important reference point with profound geopolitical, philosophical implications. So we are pleased and honored to have three panelists. Since we have three rather than four, I've agreed to give each presenter 3 more minutes, which is very significant, substantial. I suggested they still read the paper as planned and add a 3-minute self-criticism. So, without further ado, let's have our first presentation by Professor Takahiro Nakajima from University of Tokyo. Advanced Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia. His topic is Constitutionalism and Sovereignty on Japanese Constitutional Problems.
Thank you, Xudong. I'd like to start my talk with my self-criticism. I am now doing philosophy, especially on Chinese philosophy. But in my undergraduate days, I belong to the Faculty of Law, University of Tokyo, right? And I was a former student of this gentleman, Professor Yoichi Higuchi, who is really leading scholar of constitutional theory in Japan, right? Yeah, I learned many things from Professor Higuchi, but I never imagined I talk about constitutional theory in New York, right? So, over 30 years absence, I'd like to once again focus on the meaning of constitutional theory in Japan. Okay, so this is Professor Higuchi's advocation. The Constitution of Japan is none other than a declaration of human rights for Japanese society. Okay, so today I'd like to consider the relationship between constitutionalism and sovereignty. In my undergraduate days, this term, constitutionalism, was also out of focus. It was an old-fashioned notion. But in recent years, this old-fashioned notion comes back again in the debate of Japanese society. Recent years have seen the debate about the constitutional revision in Japan pushed forward by the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. The content and methods of this debate have attracted criticism from constitutionalist perspectives. Professor Hasede Yasuo of Waseda University, but he was a former U Tokyo professor. Right? He is one of the Japanese eminent theorists of constitutionalism. Makes this remark. I skipped this citation. According to him, constitutionalism is not respecting and obeying the Constitution. The reason he gives for this is that the world abounds with constitutions whose substances are not actually constitutionalist. So it is not an issue of respecting or obeying a constitution, but one knows how constitutionalism itself restricts state power. Even state power based on democracy must be respected. So now we can see the sharp confrontation between democracy and constitutionalism in the current debates in Japan. He refers to the ideas of Louis Henkin, a former professor of international law at Columbia University. He consults Henkin's distinction between constitutionalism's two elements. First, the sovereignty of the people and the system of representative democracy based on this. Second, the restraining of state power via the separation, checks and balances, and respect for individual human rights. Hassan, on the sixth. So this is Hassan's explanation. Here, he turns a truly light gaze on democracy. He also touches on Robert Dahl, former professor of political science at Yale University, in saying that democratic politics cannot resolve problems related to the fundamentals of society. Concrete examples of this failure of democracy to keep in mind include the liberation of slaves in the United States, the question of Algerian independence and the French Fourth Republic, and the ideological clashes in the Weimar Republic. Given this, what suitable approaches might we take towards the problems that we cannot, or perhaps should not, try to resolve with democracy? There are multiple ethical stances crucial enough to concern issues of life and death, and whose relative merits cannot be peremptorily decided. How should we best confront such issues? Hassan here suggests that it is possible for differing ethical stances to fairly coexist. Justice in the sense may be realized, and we may opt for the way of building a framework of social life, that is, the way of constitutionalism. What then does Hassan mean by referring to a framework of social life where it is possible for different ethical stances to fairly coexist? He continues, the byproduct. In other words, a constitutionalism that embodies what Hassan calls the principle of restraining state power based on the respect for human rights is one that places constraints on the state's power to impose particular meanings and aims on its citizens. One example where such a constraint is needed concerns the issue of state power, forcing citizens to potentially die fighting an external enemy, the premise on which military conscription systems are based. We have traced Hassan's argument to a point where several questions clearly arise. One point which requires further thought is how constitutionalism is certainly not mere relativism. State power imposes particular meanings and aims on its citizens. This is a worldwide phenomenon which was manifested in the pre-Japanese state, and which is again vividly portrayed in the draft for revising the Constitution of Japan, produced by LDP. Yeah, this is the draft. The constitutional thought makes criticism based on the principle of restraining state power. It doesn't simply stop at a neutral stance, but strives to protect the modern ethical stance of respect for human rights. Put another way, constitutionalism does not fall into the trap of empty relativism that postmodernism so often succumbs to. Instead, it inherits its dimension of modern universal values critically and historically. It thus follows that Hassan, as a constitutionalist, asserts that there is no such thing as a special Eastern variety of constitutionalism. The constitutionalism by which we seek to live is indeed a construct of artifice, the product of a modernity that has abandoned a stance of naturalism. This is Husserl's argument on the critique of naturalism. In the debate advanced by the LNP, maintaining armed forces is seen as a natural right, as is the implementation of collective self-defense. However, Husserl's stance is clearly at odds with such positions. He adopts a position of moderate pacifism in which he admits the necessity of having organs of self-defense, although not by military conscription. He therefore takes neither the side of the absolute pacifism nor that of revising Article 9, because both sides merely seek to assert a particular ethical stance as a naturalistic approach and critically attempting to realize their own values in the public sphere. In contrast, taking a position of unnatural effort, in other words, to adopt a constitutionalism that incorporates critical and historical considerations would remove the need to change the current interpretation of Article 9. I'd like to skip this part. Husserl's stance is somehow complicated. When he was asked to support the new law, 2013 Act on the Protection of Specially Designed Secrets, right? He supported that act, right? However, he refused the new law of security. So there is a very complicated situation in this constitutionalism. So I'd like to jump into Okinawa's sovereignty. Constitutionalism in Japan is being tested not only by the question of Article 9, but also that of Okinawa's sovereignty. Saying Okinawa's sovereignty sounds tricky, but I'd like to use this expression to consider a debate that concerns regional sovereignty and the multiplicity of sovereignties. The movement for Okinawa, reversion to Japan, peaked in the 1960s with the slogan of returning to the Japanese motherland under the auspices of the peace institution. The motivation for this movement is suggested by the vague concept of residual sovereignty. That is to say, despite the legal fiction that the country of Japan had residual sovereignty over Okinawa, the fact remained that Okinawa was a territory which could neither be adequately covered by the jurisdiction of the Constitution of Japan, nor that of the Constitution of the United States. The movement for reversion thus saw the restoration of provisions for human rights and the realization of an iron without military bases, in keeping with the spirit of Japan's peace constitution. However, even after Okinawa reverted to the Japanese Union in 1972, its burden of military bases remained exceedingly large, and the situation of gross neglect with regard to human rights also persisted. In the midst of the debate on the constitutional revision, the following critique emerged from Okinawa. If you want to abandon the Constitution of Japan, please give it to the people of Okinawa. This has somehow the echo of Takahiro, probably what Chin will talk Okinawa would become independent along with the Constitution of Japan. Such calls for Okinawan independence have heightened in recent years. One of the theoretical pillars of this position is found in the draft constitution authored by Kawamitsu Shinichi in 1981, titled C. Personal Draft Constitution of the Republican Society, not the state, Republican Society of Ryukyu. This is its preface. Here, I wish to call your attention to how Kawamitsu uses the concept of a Republican Society of Ryukyu. This concept does not take the premise of a state in the sense of a nation state. Instead, it is a social constitution which places the sovereignty of self-governing communities at its core. Following Kawamitsu's proposal, many other plans for Okinawa independence were proposed, which was strongly criticized by the proponents of nationalism. Very harsh criticism. Here, I'd like to consider this issue from the viewpoints of constitutionalism and sovereignty. Nakazato said that at some point, the time will come when the lasted concept of a special law for local referendum contained in Chapter 8, Article 95 of the Constitution of Japan is deployed in Okinawa. So what does he mean? So this is Article 95. Okay. Yeah, it's for the local referendum when the huge problems arise in the local community from the government. Right? Article 95 has garnered much scrutiny thanks to the theoretical insights of Kimura Soda, Professor Loren at Tokyo Metropolitan University, who introduced a new perspective by a constitutional interpretation into the debate over moving US Army bases to Henko. His argument, in essence, revolves around this Article 95. Yeah, so I skipped some parts. Yeah, this is due to how, even if this nation is democratically enacted in the Diet, the issue would still require a referendum carried out by the people of Okinawa. As stipulated in this Article 95, in order to be fully constitutional in the background to this debate, as with Hasebe's arguments earlier described, is an extremely light perspective of the working of democracy. Kimura Soda, okay. Yeah, this is Kimura's explanation. Okay, so in my view, this state of affairs arises from the question of Okinawa's sovereignty. If Kimura's three-article framework was enacted, and the popular will of Okinawa decided against the construction of bases, what would happen? Since the US military bases concern the most critical issues of our diplomacy and security, national sovereignty will be harmed by regional sovereignty. Furthermore, insofar as the debate on Okinawan independence broadly includes proposals like Kawamitsu's draft constitution, argue for abandoning the state and even establishing an independent Okinawan republic, it is clear that it challenges the sovereignty of the Japanese state. Thus, we now arrive at the question of division of sharing of sovereignty, partage of sovereignty, in the set of means with regards for constitutionalists as viewed from the issue of military bases. Yeah, this. At this juncture, let us review the notion of the sovereignty of the people. It goes without saying that it differs from state sovereignty, but it is also distinct from national sovereignty. National sovereignty assumes that people are constituted as a nation. That is, it assumes they are national sovereigns who choose their own representatives and who consent to be governed by said representatives. The exercise of sovereignty is limited to the election of representatives who are not bound by the electorate and who govern according to their own inclinations. As a result, national sovereignty creates a dissociation between the sovereign nation and the representative agents, which create the potential for it to become undemocratic. In contrast, sovereignty of the people proposes that all people are perfectly equal in political standing and that they themselves are governed as sovereigns. It follows that even if a system of representation is implemented, the elected representatives are expected to act according to the wishes of their electorate and will face expulsion if they go against those wishes. The Constitution of Japan mixes these two senses of national sovereignty and the sovereignty of the people, but in fact is applied according to the form national sovereignty. Returning to the issue of partage, the division and sharing of sovereignty, we see that there are multiple ways in which, based on the sovereignty of the people, a governing entity could be formed. Such an entity could arise from the division of sovereignty amongst states and the federation, or it could derive from the authority of an international union that straddled nations. It can also be composed of local sovereignties, which are smaller in scale and which could also be gathered into a broader transnational. Okinawa is now attempting to question the problem, which touches on this very sense of the sovereignty of the people, partage and both sovereignty. Yet this attempt raises the question of how our current democracy has avoided questioning at all. If we accept Jacques Derrida's premise that democracy to come will raise questions about the sovereignty of the people and the division and sharing of sovereignty, we will surely achieve a deeper synthesis in the debate on constitutionalism. I'd like to end up by repeating the quote that began this paper from Professor Higuchi. The Constitution of Japan is now more than a declaration of human rights for Japanese society. Constitutionalism in Japan thus depends on how it can deepen this declaration of human rights, which is called the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nakajima. Wonderful speaker. Our second presenter is Wang from Peking University. His title is For the Destituent, I hope I pronounced this word correctly, Constitution, a Politico-Philosophical Reading of Arsenal of the Japanese Constitution.
Thank you. First, I have to apologize that instead of giving a direct interpretation of Article 9 of Japanese Constitution, I'm mainly focused on a Japanese thinker whose name is Takahiro. I don't know if you know about this guy, but he's fabulous. So after my presentation, I hope that you could have a little bit, if not knowledge, then a little bit information about his thinking constitution. Years after the promulgation of the so-called peaceful constitution of Japan, Takahiro wrote an essay entitled Our Feeling for the Constitution, where he critically examines the emotional distance between the Constitution and the Japanese people. He wrote, "The new Constitution is something remote from us. Now we have these universal principles of humanity that are beautifully written in the Constitution. For all its beautifulness, however, it seems too shining to be our own. I think that the same holds true for the soldiers who engaged in that war, dying while shouting out long life the emperor. Admittedly, new education makes us faithful to the emperor. Yet these soldiers only borrowed this form to express their wishes for freedom. For lack of other means, they had to borrow this distorted form. It's a very tricky examination of the Constitution and a very weird critique of it. The claim that the Japanese have to express their wishes for freedom through distorted forms concerns, I think, Takeuchi's understanding of what the Constitution appeals to, namely these value systems and principles that directly borrow from modern Western democracies. More generally, this claim, I think, has to do with Takeuchi's own understanding of the relationship between the so-called universal principles of humanity on one hand and the subjectivity of Japan and of Asia in general on the other. Which means, without understanding Takeuchi's analysis of the historical establishment of the modern value system, without reading his critique on modernity in general, we can hardly understand the radicality of his critique of the Constitution. So in what follows, I will read his famous essay, What is Modernity?, through which I think Takeuchi's critique of the Constitution is highly associated with his argument about the relationship between literature and politics. Namely, literature finds its proper place in Takeuchi's thought only where all given political articulations and programs become inoperative, a place without place, a place that is only virtually indirectly configured. Takeuchi's critique of the Constitution in this very sense eventually leads to what he calls the connection of the weak. These are simply mysterious terms. In What is Modernity?, Takeuchi starts with a fundamental question, namely, what is the Oriental modernity? It, argues he, is the result of the coercion of the euro, or derived from the coercion of the euro. Although we may retroactively recognize characteristics in pre-modern societies as elements for the development of modernity, the very willingness or stimulus to take such a retroactive step cannot do without the so-called invasion of the euro. Takeuchi crucially argues that what underlies the European invasion has nothing to do with any program in social fields, rather it is a spirit of self-expansion. He writes, quote, modernity is the self-recognition of Europe as seen within history, the regarding of itself as distinct from the feudalistic which Europe gained in the process of liberating itself from the feudal. Therefore, it can be said that Europe is the first possible only in this history, and that history itself is possible only in this Europe. End quote. Far from being a particular one-time event in history, the European invasion of Asia is the decisive event that determines history and makes history itself possible. After defining the secondary nature of the Oriental modernity, Takeuchi writes on the Europe per se. He says, quote unquote, simply being Europe does not make Europe Europe. No matter what the motivation of the invasion of Orient is, Europe is always in the movement of willing to become itself, a movement that makes it impossible to stop at the status quo. Europe is what it is only because it ceaselessly loses itself and embraces what is other than itself. This is kind of Hegelian dialectical self-negation by self-development. Moreover, in political terms, not emphasize the term in political terms, even the resistance of Asia, the resistance, that term is Takeuchi's most famous term in his thinking. A crucial concept that has been repeatedly discussed in Japan as well as in China when people talk about Takeuchi. The resistance of Asia is resulted from the dialectical self-unfolding of the European history. He writes, quote unquote, the European invasion of the Orient produces resistance there, a resistance that was, of course, reflected in Europe itself. Yet even this could not change the thoroughgoing rationalist conviction that all things can ultimately be objectified and extracted in the Europe. resistance was calculated, and it was clear that through resistance, Asia was destined to increasingly Europeanize itself. Thus, the division between the European modernity and the Oriental modernity does not lie in the contrast between reason and resistance, if only because the Oriental resistance is always already politically reduced to an indispensable element for the European dialectics of self-expansion. It is not only produced by the European invasion, but also assimilated into the self-determinative history of the Europe in a negative theological way. He writes, quote, "It was through the Orient's resistance that Europe recognized its own triumph in the cause of comprehending the Orient within world history. This triumph was conceived in terms of cultural, ethnic, national, and economic superiority. The Orient recognized its defeat within this same process." End quote. The resistance of Asia, together with the process of modernization, cannot not politically belong to the European modernity. The modernization of Asia is nothing but the Europeanization of Asia. Modernity is European modernity. History is European history. Everything belongs to the Europe. By saying so, Takeuchi refuses the possibility of Asia's self-understanding. He says something like, Asian countries cannot self themselves. They can only self themselves by appropriating these tools, concepts, frameworks produced by the Westerner. It's highly controversial and radical, right? If Europe is represented by the notion of reason, then this is also Takeuchi. Both reason and non-reason, i.e. nature, both reason and non-reason would be European. Everything belongs to Europe. This is his own word. Asia is, after everything is said and done, Asia is only a virtual image reflected by the European substance, which embodies itself concretely in history through constant self-unfolding and self-negation. But I think we can grasp the significance of this virtual image in at least two senses. First, as a virtual image, Asia in itself cannot substantially produce its own image because even its image of retreat and failure is determined by Europe beforehand. Secondly, more important, as non-substantial, this so-called virtual image leads to an unstable element that can hardly be grasped by the European spirit. Takeuchi writes, quote unquote, "Oriental resistance were reflected in Europe. Nothing can escape Europe's eye insofar as it exists within the framework of modernity. At each crisis in which Europe becomes conscious of its own internal contradictions, those things that rise to the surface of its consciousness are always recollections of the Orient that exists latently within it. Europe's nostalgia for the Orient is one of its contradictions, and it is forced to think this Orient, the more explicit these contradictions become." On one hand, the constant resistance of Asia is politically within Europe, in that without the European invasion of Asia, there will be no Asian resistance. But on the other hand, the Asian resistance is also outside of Europe, in the very sense in which Asia can never be completely assimilated and tamed, for the self-justification of Europe is based upon its assimilation of Asia as its other. That makes sense? Alright. Where its imagination of Asia has to be constantly reproduced. It's kind of post-colonial theory, ABC. You have to reproduce constantly your other in order to finish and continue the process of self-negation and self-unfolding. Now, nothing new here, but something surprising happens when Takeuchi continues. With regard to this paradoxical resistance, this element that is simultaneously within and without Europe, Takeuchi confesses by saying that, quote unquote, "I know not what resistance is. I cannot engage in examining the meaning of resistance. I'm not good at philosophical thinking. I can only feel that there's something there. but I cannot extract it for a theoretical construction. I cannot do that, not because it is impossible, but because I am powerless. In the last analysis, I know not whether this is possible. Now, I want to emphasize the term powerlessness here, because for Takeuchi, powerlessness does not mean inability. On the contrary, the position of powerlessness is exactly, for him, the position of literature. In his famous work on Lu Xun, a Chinese writer, Takeuchi writes on the relationship between literature and politics. Quote, literature is powerless. Powerlessness refers to the powerlessness of literature towards politics. That is, what is powerful towards politics is not literary. The powerlessness of literature towards politics is due to the fact that literature as such alienates politics while engaging with it. End quote. The powerlessness of literature is a refusal of the European reason and political programming. The Asian resistance gives birth to a literary subjectivity that is only powerless in contradistinction to the self-unfolding, self-negating, self-developing Hegelian subjectivity that is powerful. In political terms, then, why does this powerless subjectivity and powerlessness matter? The answer is, according to Takeuchi, connection or connectedness. In a note of travel written in 1942, Takeuchi talks about his experience of reading Nakajima. He says, quote unquote, the powerlessness is as follows. Through reading one's own powerlessness, one utterly becomes being itself, whereby one lives in the heart of the other. Literature, I believe, is exactly something like this. Literature is such an action, namely through becoming nothing, it influences the other's mind. First, literature is by nature different from political resistance. For Nakao's work is written when the author gives up any hope on political resistance. Literary resistance, for all its powerlessness, establishes a non-dialectical, non-substantial, and non-theorizable connection between the self and the other. Second, this connectedness of connection is related to Takeuchi's understanding of Asia. Because far from being a geopolitical concept, Asia, in Takeuchi's thought, signifies the suppressed and the weak. Takeuchi writes, quote unquote, this is in an essay called Asian Nationalism. In order to get rid of the suppressive imperialism, Asia only has two methods, either to become imperialist as well, or to extricate imperialism out of the world. In Asian countries, Japan chose the first, while many other countries, including China, chose the second. It's a method of nationalism characteristic of the connection of the weak, rather than an exclusive nationalism. The confrontation between literature and European politics keeps the connection of the weak from any political logic of identification. Asia is not a geopolitical concept, for it is nothing other than a name for this connection that is always non-identical. As Naoki Sakai writes, quote unquote, resistance in Takeuchi Yoshimi cannot form the structure of identity of the subject. In other words, if negation is determinative of the subject through opposing the negated term, then resistance is not negation. Rather, it is close to negativity that is explicitly distinguished from negation. Now let's come back to Takeuchi's critique of the Japanese constitution. Positively establishing a value system as universal, the constitution is non-literary. Of course it's non-literary, but what does it mean? Non-literary in the sense that the constitution deeply involves Japan in the process of self-Europeanization, so that Japan will become one particular moment in the world history determined by the European modernity. Non-literary in the sense that Japan loses the Asian perspective, unable to confront its invasion of Asian countries, unable to think of alternatives to capitalism from the position of the connection of the weak. a position without position, a position that is non-localizable and non-identical. In this sense, to subjectivize itself means for Takeuchi to posit a literary position of nothingness, which does not usher in a more comprehensive, more powerful subject, but a connection with the weak, a connection that is not politically programmable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonsei. Our third speaker is Loren Goodman from Yonsei University in Korea. His topic is Poetic, Impositions, Japanese-US Constitutional Problems of Peace and Tranquility. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And my entire paper is self-criticism. As Garrett Epps declares in his 2013 constitutional study, Poetry of the Preamble, while the phrase, "we the people of the United States," is etched deep in the national consciousness, the people were not involved in its composition. Epps argues that those who wrote it speak to the people in their own voice so effectively that they have come to believe it issued from, rather than being all but imposed upon them. One wonders to what extent this holds true for the Japanese people, whose peace constitution, 1946, composed by General MacArthur's military staff during the US occupation, employs the same "we the people" language in its preamble. In examining the US Constitution as a poetic text, Epps also applies Charles Olson's definition of poetry as a field of energy transfer from where the poet got it by way of the poem itself to the reader. A high energy construct, and at all points an energy discharge. The electrical metaphor recalls another useful definition of poetry, Ezra Pound's as charged language, capable of transmitting shock. It is difficult to imagine a shock of textual energy transfer greater than the one that occurred on February 13, 1946, when General Whitney, acting under MacArthur's order, informed Minister Matsumoto Joji his constitutional draft revision, being insufficiently democratic, had been rejected in favor of a US government section version, drafted over the course of 1 week by a team of 24. Such shock compounded by the ultimatum that this was his cabinet's last chance to save the emperor and remain in power. If they did not accept it by February 20th, Whitney threatened to deliver it directly to the Japanese people. Adding ventriloquistic insult to injury, the Japanese not only had to accept this foreign constitution, they were required to defend its legitimacy by maintaining the fiction that they had authored it themselves. Considering the history of the constitutionally commandeered voices of the Japanese people, I wish to explore their peace constitution as a poetic text with some attention to how it is read and what it means to the people who continue to live under it, to see how contemporary Japanese people in their own voices make sense of it. In considering the formalist elements of poetry such as rhyme and meter as primarily mnemonic pedagogical devices, one might also liken the temporal duress of the deadline to meter as a formal characteristic of texts based on time. In this respect, MacArthur's time constraint had a monumental unintended effect in democratizing politics in Japan. Prior to the 1946 Constitution, all legal documents were composed in bungotai, the classic Japanese text inaccessible to the majority of the people. Because the cabinet was not able to translate the GS draft into bungotai in the allotted time, they wrote it in colloquial Japanese. This set a new precedent. All government documents from then on were written in kogotai, colloquial Japanese. The thrice repeated
invocation, "We, the Japanese people," in the 1946 preamble, serves to establish anaphora, infusing the piece with a song-like, prayer-like quality that goes beyond that of the 1789 template. But whose prayer? In some ways, it feels like that of the American composers, a prayer that they would never again be confronted by such a formidable enemy. Read sympathetically, the preamble, with its commitment to preserve our security and existence through trusting in the faith of the peace-loving peoples of the world, is incredibly idealistic. Read critically, it is patronizing, vindictive, oppositional. The first draft reveals such sentiments in its detailed condemnations and impossible project of enforcing not just domestic, but total international peace. It said originally, "The blessings of liberty throughout this land, and we secure for ourselves and our posterity the fruits of peaceful cooperation with all nations and the blessings of liberty throughout this land, and resolve that never again shall this nation or any other nation be visited with the horrors of war through the arrogance of irresponsible officials or the greed for power of entrenched wealth and position." Coupled with phrases like, so they made it much more objective, vague, abstract. Coupled with phrases like, "We desire to occupy," an emphasis on obedience, it resembles an inversion of the thwarted imperial project, an endless reminder of defeat. In this light, "We the Japanese people" sounds less like an empowering refrain and more like a conceit of the GHQ as religious colonizer forced into the mouths of the defeated in catechistic fashion in order to penetrate, if not via explanation, through sheer force of repetition. Nothing quite captures the oppositional exchanges of the text, as well as the parody produced by the Smash the Security Treaty organization in the red, and the real one is on the left. Can read it. That said, the pedagogical tone could also be seen as self-directed. GS staff admitted their project began as an academic exercise, the function of having to convince themselves they were up to the daunting task of composing a constitution in a week. Perhaps the most mysterious thing about the "We the Japanese people" lyric is that the "we," the first person plural that accounts for most of its music and Vedic performativity, the most poetic element of the anaphoric arrangement, is eliminated from the Japanese text. Without it, it operates in the third person, such that one does not know who is talking or who is being addressed. So it's just it sounds like third person. Don't quote me much. It doesn't say why quote me. But the first person is, it's not likely the result of pronoun omission, as the first person plural appears repeatedly throughout the body of the text. Whether an oversight in translation and retranslation, the paring away of an unfamiliar allusion, or an act of resistance in rejection of an alien American voice, Informant H suggests the Japanese voice requires a different song. Quote, "I think that Japanese people, protected by the peace constitution and the US military, are to some extent the naive beneficiaries of an artificial state of peace. You must protect peace with your own hands. You can't leave it to others. It is regrettable that after the war, education to protect the country has not been enacted. At elementary schools in the United States, kids put their hands to their chests every morning. The words 'for our country' must be sung. This is a point that is lacking in Japanese education. The Constitution changed everything. I feel we must preserve our Constitution no matter what. It emphasizes peace and nothing but peace. 150 years ago, the modern Japan started by adapting, not adopting Western ways. So this is from a different, Though the music may be lost, Informant A sincerely embraces the heroic qualities of the text. The Constitution changed everything. I feel we must preserve our Constitution no matter what. It emphasizes peace and nothing but peace. 150 years ago, modern Japan started by adapting, not adopting, Western ways. So why not embrace the US-made Constitution as long as it's a good thing? Informant C takes a similar approach, expressing pride in the capacity for adaptation. A mentions as a unique Japanese ability. We Japanese have a long history of utilizing foreign things. For example, we have learned from China and imported a lot of things like Chinese characters or Buddhism. So we don't mind importing even our Constitution. If it is practical and useful. In fact, it was useful in the Cold War. It allowed Japan to develop its economy without using much military costs. Whether it was written by you or by others, you better accept its good aspects. This is one of our Japanese virtues. While there is a sense of resignation in Informant A's orientation, quote, I oppose amendment, but after all, we have no choice but to be protected by the US. Informant C expresses an imperturbable resilience and positivity. Quote, we unconsciously interpreted being forced as being chosen. Both A's and C's comments resonate with Masao Murayama's concept of basso ostinato, the notion that Japanese culture is a kind of universally accommodating baseline able to bend any foreign melody to its own societal harmony. Wary of fetishizing Japanese singularity, Informant D adds some interesting nuances. Quote, the notion of constitution is a product of enlightenment. As a civilization that does not belong to the origin of enlightenment, any law that we pass will be an adaptation or variation of the original, and that is fine. A constitution is not a means to express people's sentiment, to express they are fundamentally unique. Informant E voices a radically different pedagogical mythology. Japan, quote, Japan's colonial policy was fundamentally different from that of the West. Western colonial policy enslaved indigenous peoples. Japan educated indigenous peoples and treated them like Japanese. Also, the contents of the 1946 Constitution were composed simply to prevent Japan from competing with or opposing the West. They just brainwashed Japan and with education and history convenient to the purposes of the West. It's Japan's fault. What they did was terrible. It is sad how China and the Korean Peninsula have also been made to believe in these lies, and this fabricated history is now thought of as the truth. The only meaning of peace in the current constitution is that Japan cannot oppose the West. It is not a real peace constitution for Japan. Not quite as skeptical, Informant B takes pleasure in two features of the forced 1946 Constitution, which go beyond those of the United States. Quote, I am glad that the Japanese did not write the Constitution. Otherwise, not only Article 9, the renunciation of war, but also Article 24, providing for gender equality, would never have been included. I also find some irony in the imposed Constitution because Article 9 indicates an ideal that even Americans cannot live up to. Apart from the sonic and mnemonic formal elements, poetry and the 1946 Constitution share another defining characteristic, ambiguity. Both are carefully constructed for ambiguity. In many cases, ambiguity was introduced by the Japanese through translation, their primary mechanism for navigating and resisting GS demands. Though subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, the first Japanese version of the GS Constitution was completely cut out the preamble. Shifts in terminology, the Japanese were able to subvert and substantially alter constitutional content. As Mark Yakic states in Poetry, A Survivor's Guide, the primary intent of poems is to discomfit sensible thinking in order to provide an alternative sense. Poetry works through juxtaposition, providing a space where two opposing concepts can be held in the mind simultaneously without having to reach for either one. This is Keats' negative capability. Poetic ambiguity manifests in paradox, cognitive dissonance, oxymoron, aporia, difference, all ways of putting the reader in an ostensibly uncomfortable position. This kind of discomfort is evident in Informant E's argument for amendment. Quote, the meaning of SDF, self-defense force, and army are different. If the army makes a judgment that the enemy is going to attack, we can launch a preemptive attack. The SDF cannot fight back until it is attacked. A self-defense force cannot take action until it is being attacked. Don't you think it's a little too late to think about taking action after your territory has already been invaded? One would be hard-pressed to find an instance of constitutional ambiguity more evident than that of the cognitive dissonance surrounding the paradox of Article 9's theoretical renunciation of war and Japan's real-world maintenance and deployment of military forces. Perhaps this is due to the fact that both sides had an interest in making Article 9 ambiguous. Informant B's mixed feelings well capture this sense of ambiguity. I have mixed feelings toward the peace stressed in the Constitution. The peace in post-war Japan has been maintained by the post-1945 Gisei sacrifice of neighboring American-led regimes backed by dictatorships and war for decades, South Korea, Taiwan, Okinawa. At the same time, raised by parents who had opposed the 1960 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty and then provided their children with the comfort of liberal middle-class lifestyle, I am the very product of post-war Japan and its peace constitution, and until recently tended to take peace, democracy, and prosperity for granted. In embracing defeat, John Dower provides an important example of resistance achieved through translation, involving the choice of a term for the people. By replacing the term Jinmin, the term used to translate the people in the Gettysburg Address, which has some socialist or communist connotations that were anathema to the reactionary cabinet, with kokumin, literally country people, connoting a harmonious relationship between the people and the state, the cabinet was able to exclude non-Japanese citizen residents, such as the descendants of Korean forced laborers and other minority groups, from the protections of human rights, the injustice of which Informant B only recently became aware. Quote, recently through conversations with dissident Okinawans and Zainichi and South Koreans, I came to view how deceptive the concept of Japan as a peaceful nation was. While Beata Sirota, one of only 4 women on the drafting team, and the one responsible for the article about equality of gender, insisted we never felt as though we were teaching the Japanese, it is difficult to deny the pedagogical thrust of the 1946 Constitution in effecting MacArthur's 3 principles: maintaining the emperor, renouncing war, and eliminating feudalism. His staff composed the new Constitution to inculcate democracy, popular sovereignty, human rights, and its anticipation of the imminent war crimes tribunals, universal law, to which state sovereignty is subordinate. The revolutionary nature of the Peace Constitution is expressed succinctly and ingeniously in these educational before and after posters, which I won't talk about too much, but you can see in the first frame, so there's the people bow down and venerate the official with an offering. In the second, the positions are reversed. The official is depicted as a public servant, occupying a physically lower position than the people. And the gestures of pointing are quite different, subservient in the first and directive in the second. And in the third and fourth, you see the relative worth or significance of the emperor, nobility, male and female people expressed through physical size, and a platform boosting each other in descending order. In the fourth panel, the platforms that convey privilege are removed by the vehicle, the literal vehicle of the says Constitution on the side of the truck. And each member of society is equal size, status, and significance. What I find so funny about this is that the nobility, the second from the left, is still there, just the word nobility has been crossed out. It still has nice clothing. Supposed to get rid of peerage. Second estate. Yeah. And here, 5 and 6, the Army and Navy generals hold court over the cabinet members from an elevated position. They face each other oppositionally. It's a one-way address. The facial expressions of the cabinet members are disgruntled, hands on hips. But in panel 6, the military has been replaced by flowers. Cabinet members sit around the table with a variety of expressions, some smiling, some serious, but none angry. In 7, it expresses the imbalance of patriarchy in the household. All power emanates from the father. 1 controls the property, 2 decides who his children will marry, 3 handles all public matters, 4 dominates his wife. But in 8, the wife and the husband marry out of mutual agreement. are equal in addressing public matters and discuss everything and decide together. You can see the husband looks much happier. Listening to informant E, one can only imagine the difficulties of rapid adjustment to such comprehensive social changes. There probably aren't any people in the world who know the frustrations of the peace constitution as much as the Japanese. However, I think that today's education lacks or fails to instill the consciousness of protecting your own country by yourself. My grandmother was the daughter of a samurai. I grew up with my grandfather and uncle in an officer's house, so I am familiar with the meaning of dedicating my life to the country. In my grandfather's generation, we fought with the United States, but my whole family loved America, and we still like it. In conclusion, as Epps equates the drafters of the US Constitution who speak to the people in their own voice with Calliope, not the poet, who tells the tale of Hector and Achilles, it remains to be seen whether the American literary agents of the Japanese Constitution were poets, muses, or simply vehicles for some other spirit of history. Muses or not, Americans who were once loved and now just liked.
So we have almost 30 minutes for discussion. Any questions? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I'm very interested. Joanne and I went to a 70th anniversary Hiroshima bombing conference in August. I was opening 2 closing featured speakers there. And when we came back, there was a rally against the change in the peace constitution, which we unfortunately missed because we had to get our flight. But when we got back in Tokyo that day, that was in August of 2015. But yesterday when I made my presentation on Reporters Without Borders, the G7 countries, Japan used to be at the top with Canada and Germany. You know, it used to be the top 3, and they were like 10th, 16th, and Japan was 22nd back in 2012. In 2017, it dropped to number 72. Militarism tends to pull you down. The other ones that towards the bottom are the militaristic 3 in NATO, Britain, France, and the United States are sort of in the 40s, and only Berlusconi in Italy did worse because he owns the press. But Japan fell out of grace from 22nd in the world to 72nd in the world over that period. And I presume it's because of the struggles with the peace constitution that are going on in Japan.
What's the question?
Well, so is that true? What's your experience of the press in Japan? Is there a lot of manipulation going on by the president or the whatever in trying to change the constitution that's creating difficulties in Japan? Apparently that seems to be the theme of the whole discussion, and I just ask, how true is that in terms of the press? Let's cover this.
So there have been a bunch of debates on the peace constitution. You know, ruling party, LDP, the Liberal Party, has its own, original idea in which we have to divide this peace constitution into, original, right? Yeah, but right now our Prime Minister Abe shows us some new direction of the division of the constitution. That is just to put the the third third, not article, but the third part for the Article 9, in order to write down the defense force as a national arm. So right now, we are thinking of all the debate on peace constitution is somehow shrinking, right? Yeah, so it has not. It doesn't have a, theoretical or constitutional, principle debate on peace constitution. It is now narrowly shrinked, right? But people in Hiroshima totally disagree with this direction of revision. So in the Japanese society, there is a very harsh tension between the revision of the constitution and the protection of the constitution.
I don't know much about the press, but as Professor Nakajima mentioned, I think Abe's goal now is to see in the Article 9 it says that Japan will maintain no military air, sea, or land forces. But there was no ruling of law by the Supreme Court. Kenneth Port makes a point about this, that it was always just interpreted to mean that they can have defense, because the second paragraph is subordinate to the first, so they interpret it to mean that no military forces can be used to attack another country, but they would have the right of defense. So what Abe wants to do is actually put language as the third part that says to write it in that we can have a self-defense force. It's not in there, right? It's just been interpreted that way, which is I'm not sure why he wants to do that actually.
As I remember, this religion causes a sort of translation problem in China, because it's now translated as something like group fighting rights. Namely, Japan, even though it could not attack another country all by itself, it could join, presumably US-led military intervention by sending troops overseas. So China reads in this sort of as something very slippery. So no. But
I think that was legislated in 2015.
Oh, that's an older debate.
Yeah, no, but
No,
it's
not here. It's not
It's
kind
not?
of legally written as a right. But no, I don't want to kind of intervene, but I just want to add one very little thing. Clause 2 of Article 9 is something like as follows. I have it here. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, see, that's the controversial part. So you can have different interpretations of the first clause, but then land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential. So everything is included here. You have potentiality for war itself. The potentiality of war itself is kind of excluded as a possibility, and then will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. This is very, very weird. Since after World War II, no nation state has the right of waging war against another state. It's not a kind of legal right. No nation state on earth has the right of belligerency of the state.
okay, let's leave it here, and we could come back to this issue. Russell?
Yeah, thanks for this really thought-provoking panel. What I learned is that the notion of constitution is itself slippery. Constitution, it can have a descriptive character. We the people exist, and the Constitution expresses that. or the Constitution is performative and expresses aspirations. We the people in order to. So I think that generates ambiguity necessarily in any constitutional document, not just the Japanese Constitution. The United States Constitution, the tension between the articles and the Bill of Rights, I think this is the center of constitutional law debates all day, or the issue of slavery, absolutely ambiguous in the Constitution. Which brings me back to Professor Nakajima's quotation from Higuchi. The Constitution of Japan is nothing more than a declaration of human rights for Japanese society. What on earth does that mean? Does that mean that this Constitution gives human rights as up here? Or does that mean that this Constitution imposes exogenous documents, right, either from the French Revolution or from the United Nations, onto Japan in a kind of benevolent, quote unquote, imperialist manner? What does he mean by that?
Yeah. Professor Higuchi tries to think of the legitimacy of this current constitution of Japan. What legitimizes Japanese constitution, and he tries to adopt the French Revolution image. Oh, we the people have the constitutional power to launch the new constitution. There was a kind of revolution between the pre-war period and post-war period. So we have the new constitution deriving from the revolutionary power, constitutional power from the people. That is the basement of Professor Higuchi's thinking of the legitimacy of the constitution. That is why he intentionally refers to the French type of declaration of human rights in the Constitution of Japan. But as Loren says, it's a really ambiguous, performative interpretation of the Constitution of Japan. So that's why, like Professor Hasebe, he does not follow this direction at all. Right? He cannot admit any sort of constitutional power. No, there's no such mythical power to legitimize the Constitution. No, Constitution is just inheritance of the former constitutions involving the Japanese pre-war constitution and also other constitution in international law. So there is a very sharp distinction of the images to the legitimacy of the constitution. That is why the confrontation between democracy and constitutionalism is a new way of interpretation of the legitimacy of the constitution.
I also thought about this. I was wondering whether this human rights specifically points to the direction of popular sovereignty in order to exclude the emperor, the militaristic state, and all these these layers, and to form some kind of immediacy of the artists. I was just wondering. Otherwise this language is strange.
If I could just follow up. 1945, 46, 47 in Japan. Was this constitution experienced as imperialist imposition? Was there no domestic democratic sentiment in the population? I'm thinking of this analogous to Germany in 1819, where there was also arguments that this was an imposed constitution from the West, but at the same time, enormous democratic sentiment and hostile to the emperor, to the Kaiser.
Yeah, there were some challenges to write down a new constitution after 1945, right? Yeah, maybe those attempts were coming from the popular alone, right? And Professor Higuchi relied on the theme of Miyazawa Toshioshi, right? Who also wrote down one possible image of constitution with Maruyama Masao, right? So it shows, but it was not radical, right? That's why Professor Higuchi tried to reinterpret this, challenge in his own way. So that's why in the first lecture, I remember in the first lecture of the Japanese Constitution, he proposed us, hey guys, we have to distinguish two different notions. One is sovereignty of the people, another is sovereignty of the nation. That is completely different. So we have to rely on the sovereignty of the people instead of sovereignty of the nation. So Japanese Constitution can show this direction. So that is first lecture.
Interesting. Donna.
More of an observation and a light-hearted observation for Loren. But I was just thinking about your discussion about whether it's necessary to add language about self-defense or along those lines. And I was thinking about Kiyoshi Kurosawa's recent movie, Before We Vanish. And there is a totally different attitude, and I think the debate must be a cultural debate in Japan. We can change the minds of our aggressor. So we don't really need to defend ourselves because we can change their minds before they attack us. So I was wondering, what about that?
Well, that makes me think of what Dr. Wang, you were talking about, the sense of literature as picking up where politics leaves off, or
Exactly.
also, I guess, one of the people who was instrumental, it's not in the Constitution, but they had this thing called the Declaration of Humanity of the Emperor. So the Constitution was designed, the peace constitution was changing something that was established in the 1889 Meiji Constitution, which was based on the Prussian constitution, constitutional monarchy to popular sovereignty. So they wanted to retain the emperor, but as all his power has to come from the people. The way it's written, the emperor derives his power from the people. Right? So, so one of the people who wrote that also wasn't written by the Japanese. It was written by R.H. Bly, this British poet and translator of haiku, and famously, when the emperor publicly announced that he was no longer divine, he turned to his wife and said, "Do I look any different?" but what R.H. Bly, in his studies of haiku and ranga and so on, his driving idea was that the principles of Zen literature are universal, are in all literatures, and that the idea of satori is a passivity, that a positive passivity that comes through, where you're talking about nothingness. I was curious about, is that in a similar vein? Yeah.
You can jump in really quick. So we have David, and we have Joy, and Zhang, and Sam. To keep your questions as short as possible and keep your answers as short as possible, so we have a productive round of discussion.
So it's fascinating panel. The question I have for you was whether you thought this. I'm interested in this debate about Okinawa, right? And how the sovereignty issue is kind of complicated by what Loren was saying, because you're sort of indicating that there's a kind of almost giving up of sovereignty on part of the entire Japanese people in a sense, right? But then you're talking about sort of this conflict about sovereignty between Japan and Okinawa, but where it seemed like the point of contention was really American base, right? Was it like a lot of it was like, why do we have to deal with this base? And if we had sovereignty, we could kick them out or something like that. We as sort of democratically, we could like make some decisions about that. But it seems like overall that it's a sort of issue of nobody wants to kind of make the sacrifices to deal with national security, which is being guaranteed by the United States in a sense. The sovereignty that we're talking about is one which, if we remember Paul Pong's lecture, there's an indication that there's a notion of sacrifice that has to go along with sovereignty. And here, there's almost a sense in which that concept of sacrifice has kind of disappeared, right? There's no sense of, well, we're supposed to sacrifice for our national defense because we're not allowed to do national defense, and we've just kind of we've offloaded it to the United States, and so that there's a whole different notion of what it means, what sovereignty then means, because then you get this idea of the human rights equal sovereignty, in which you're kind of indicating that there is this sort of non-sacrificial notion of sovereignty in which you kind of dissolve it into a general human right, so that who's if all sovereignty is a sort of indication of our sacrifice for some ideal, which would be the nation typically, but here you can't do that to the nation, then you're doing it to the human rights, and then there's a kind of dissolution of the whole idea of sacrifice, perhaps. But I don't know. I'm just kind of trying to think it through based on the different presentations.
Right after the 1945, Takahiro thought of the shared divided sovereignties. Right? We can divide Japan into 4 different states, and each state has its own constitution. Right? So, but this was just trial thinking at the time. But Okinawa's program does not necessarily, derive from the U.S. base program. No, Okinawa has its own, unique history, right? And by referring to their own history, they are thinking, if mainland Japan abandons the idea of the peace constitution, we can make another state or another republican society in Okinawa. So that's not just
But what does it mean to have a peace constitution in Okinawa? They put one of the hugest bases in the world.
Sure. Yeah, sure. In reality, they are trying to eliminate U.S. military bases for Okinawa. Sure. But in reality, it's really, really hard for the mainland Japanese politicians, right? And even the scholars relying on the constitutionalism cannot face this problem. So that's why maybe we are now facing the new dimension of democracy. That's my observation.
I think yes, one of the huge differences or changes from the Meiji Constitution, the points of contention to the peace constitution, was in the Meiji Constitution it provided for human rights, but there was this corollary or qualification is that the people have human rights as long as it does not interfere with the law or as far as it is not as prescribed by law. So the U.S. GS wanted to get rid of that completely because the old guard said, well, there's no, we have human rights already. There's just, but MacArthur said precisely that's the point that was abused by the governing people, that they suppressed the people with that clause. So Prime Minister Nakasone said when as this peace article was developed, that Japan is now, there's kind of an exchange going on. A space of peace is created in order to make a space for war. So Japan is like it becomes an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. And Okinawa even more so, because you think the history of, this is something I wanted to ask you about too, the relationship between mainland and Japan, mainland Japan and Okinawa has always been one of tension and, the sense that there's some sense, I think, that in the final battles of World War II and so on, the Okinawans were used as like cannon fodder. They did make a sacrifice, huge sacrifice. So that this is repeated in order for Japan to be peace, a place of peace, mainland Japan, this outlying territory is a place of war.
In the interest of saving time, could I ask you to
very quick question. Cyber war in the consciousness is a clean war, disabling satellites. I mean, not just bots, so we're familiar with that. But I'm just wondering if, again, that has emerged as a possibility in the Japanese consciousness of levels.
I was going to say that let's collect all the questions and ask the panel to address all of them. Okay. The second question I think was Zhang.
Yeah, I just want to direct one question to Wang. You said that Yoshimi stated that to think constitutionally is unnatural, for sort of unnatural thing for a human being, right? I think that sort of makes a lot of sense. I mean, in some ways, when a private person begins to think sort of constitutionally, he transforms himself into this abstract sort of subject of the state rather than a simple private person. But when he also says that Europe sees its own triumphant image in Asia, right? Does Japan, what does Japan do? In some ways, I wonder if this sort of Hegelian logic is also, being applied to Japan itself. Does Japan also see its own triumphant image in China, or is there also room for Japan to the matter of fact is actually, this is both a moment of belittling and also self-aggrandizement, because Europe definitely does not just see its triumphant image in Asia; it also sees its own triumphant image in India, in Africa, in all those other places, right? So it's that also somehow in the end is the whole thing, is it a sort of a performance act? Is it sort of a purely a literary metaphor, or there's a real some kind of constitutional thinking?
I'll only look briefly at sort of the way that the constitutional project in Japan post-war was an effort to reform or educate the self-image of the Japanese people, and especially these posters at the very end really brought that home. How successful, or what were the greatest challenges that Japanese educational institutions face, like teaching about the new constitution, adapting the consciousness of both educators and the educated to that new constitution? It's an area that you all three suggested in some way, but we didn't get into, and so I'd love a little bit about it.
Yes, I have a very silly question. Has anybody ever written a poem about sovereignty in Japan?
Yeah, this is I guess actually for Loren. I was thinking of Germany after the Second World War. I know Russ mentioned the first, where there was opposition to the U.S. Allied, but mostly U.S. imposed structure in many ways, and there was a generational effect. After 20 or so years, there was a repudiation of the generation of World War II, and now there's a critique of the repudiation, right? So we have three or so. And I was wondering if you could speak briefly to generational effects in Japan.
In 5 minutes. At least 5 minutes, let's keep in mind we're eating into our coffee break.
Okay, I'll be as concise as humanly possible. According to Takeuchi Yoshimi, the answer will be as follows, quote unquote, Japan is nothing. I can explore. I can elaborate it on it in the further break.
So about the cyber war, I'm not so sure, but if, considering all the deployments and actions of the SDF, Self-Defense Force, from even before it was called the Self-Defense Force, and it was just like the police force, they sent minesweepers to Korea, to Incheon Harbor. They sent medical support to the Gulf, Persian Gulf. Any number of these things. Apparently, they never killed anyone. No one has died at the hands of a member of these forces. And then as far as the poem, Japanese people write poems about everything. And about Germany, the question about the generational thing. One of the informants, I asked, the informant mentioned something about, or asked about the young people. It somehow came up in the discussion. And what I remember they reported was that they went to their favorite cafe that posted all these signs that said, "War is over," or "No more war is ended," or something like that. But then it was people vandalized it, and she said, the person said, sorry, I gave away gender, that these young people seem to have never heard of Zhang and Yoko. And then it also gave examples about the hip hop culture is now very disturbing, violent, militant, and all kinds of celebrations of like extreme kamikaze activity in moe, manga, things like that. So indicated that there is a great generational, there's this back swing that you referred to.
Teaching about new constitution. The Ministry of Education diffused the book entitled "Story about New Constitution." Right, but it was a really nice, explanation of new constitution in 1950s. Right, yeah. At the moment, much of poems or novels of celebrity also distributed. But after that, for example, in middle school, high school, the teaching of the constitution or about the constitution is somehow restricted, right? So we have now such air cookie, right, in education system. But thanks to Mr. Abe, now we have a very active debates on the constitution. Probably atmosphere will be shifted in education.
Well, since we wondered that I can't resist, but I wanted to add a perspective. I think the elephant in the room here is something Carl Schmitt observed in his writings on war. The international law or international order is first and foremost about deciding on war and peace. In other words, Japanese constitution, looking from inside, all these complicated movements and thoughts, ambiguity, but from outside, it's really about Americans' sort of military supremacy after the Second World War. It's the Yalta system, international order, this ambiguity, however experienced internally by the Japanese people from outside, for instance, China, Korea, they would want to play along. It's just pretend this is normalcy, right? Because as long as this post-Second World War order is in place, we don't have to worry about the remilitarization of Japan and so on and so forth. So I guess that it reflects fundamentally the last war and as a consequence, this current order. So Japanese constitution, I guess it in itself is a product of international law.
Yeah.
Right? As much as the internal
the considerations.
Yeah, that's why now there is a very new trend to think a possibility of, for example, East Asian constitution, right? So it's a new type of international constitution from the Japanese constitution debate. Yeah, that's a completely new trend. Yeah, I don't know what direction it goes in the future, but it's a lot of thinking.
So let's thank the panel again.